Hey, so this is a quick rundown of Maestro. So if you're not already familiar with temporal, I'd recommend taking a look at temporal first. What's the goal behind Maestro? It's to take the best aspects of temporal and then simplify things down as much as possible. So whereas with temporal, you need to deploy a separate temporal server, and this server is composed of multiple horizontally scalable components. With Maestro, all you need are two Postgres tables. Maestro's packaged as a simple library that you can include as a dependency via Gradle or Maven, and Maestro comes with its own embedded UI. So we can take a look at that here. Currently, we don't have any workflows created, but we're gonna change that really soon. We're gonna create our first workflow, and yeah, let's get started. This is a simple Spring Boot controller with two HTTP endpoints. This endpoint allows one to create an order, and this endpoint allows you to confirm an order and pass in a tracking number. So we can see here that in order to kick off a workflow, we call maestro.newWorkflow and we pass in the workflow implementation class. And we also specify some workflow options. So these workflow options encapsulate a workflow ID. And in our case, we're going to use the order ID as the workflow ID. And here we have our instantiated workflow. We call it an order workflow. And then we're able to call a method or a function of that workflow. That in this case, it's submit order, and we pass in our order. So let's take a look at the order workflow interface. So it's a simple Java interface that's annotated with this workflow interface annotation. We have a couple methods here, one of which is this submit order method that we just called, and it's annotated with the workflow function annotation. And this other method, which is confirm shipped, which is annotated with a signal function annotation. We'll cover that a little bit later. So let's take a look at the implementation of our workflow now. So here we have an implementation of that interface, and we can see the implementation of the submit order method. It takes that order and then it calls a few different activities to process the order. And activities are just kind of like steps or stages of a workflow. So we can see here that we're reserving some inventory. We're then processing the payment. And then we're sending an order confirmed email. And then we are awaiting on some conditions. So we're waiting for the tracking number to no longer be null. So it starts off null, but then it is mutated here in this confirm shipped method, which if we remember from the interface, that was annotated with signal functions. So signal functions enable external systems to send signals or triggers to a workflow, and we'll see how that's used. But yeah, here we can see that the tracking number is being set right by sending in that signal. So we can go back to our controller. We can see that once this HTTP endpoint is called and that tracking number is passed in, we again instantiate that workflow in the same way that we did here to get an instance of the workflow, and then we're just simply able to call that confirm shipped method of the workflow in order to actually set that tracking number. And once that tracking number is set, then this condition evaluates to true. So tracking number will no longer be null, and the workflow can then proceed further along in its processing. So once this condition is satisfied, we go further down here. We can see examples of some activities being done in parallel using this async.function uh, method. So, we're kicking off uh, the sending of this order shipped email, and then in parallel we are decreasing the inventory. And then here we're awaiting on both of these activities to complete. And once they're both complete, we then sleep. We then put this workflow to sleep for 10 seconds. And this can be, in this case, it's just 10 seconds, but it can be as long as you like. So this can sleep for, hours or days or weeks or months even. And Maestro can handle any period of time, no problem. And then after this this sleep time elapses, we finally send some special offer push notification, and we then finish off our workflow. We complete our workflow with by returning this order finalized object. So let's take a look at one of these activities, this inventory activity. We can see here that the inventory activity is again a simple interface similar to that workflow interface we already viewed. And in this case, given that it's an interface, it's annotated with activity interface as opposed to workflow interface. And again, it has a couple functions here, or a couple methods similar to the ones that we saw in the workflow interface. So let's take a look at the implementation. Implementation is very simple. It just implements that interface. And here we have some dummy methods that are just, printing something to the console. And, that's about it. They're not doing much here. But this is just, an example application. And finally, we can take a look at the configuration. So how do we wire all of this together? So we create this config bean where we actually, register the workflow implementation types. So we register that order workflow impl class, right? So that's this class that we already viewed. And then we also register the various activities that are going to be able to be injected here into this class. So Maestro takes care of actually injecting those activities into the order workflow impl class. So as long as we register those activities here, those activity implementations here, Maestro will actually take care of injecting them into the workflow implementation class, as long as we have fields, corresponding to each activity, and those fields need to be annotated with this activity annotation. And then, yeah, here in the config bean, we're just registering the implementations of each of those activities. So activities can also take, dependencies, right? So this notification activity impl, it takes an email service as a dependency. So its constructor has this single parameter, and here you'll notice that when we're instantiating this notification activity impl, we're passing in that email service into its constructor. Additionally, we can specify activity options when we're registering an activity. So in this case, we are specifying, so we're registering this payment activity impl, and we're also passing in these activity options where we specify a duration of 1 minute for the started to completed timeout. All that means all that means is that this activity will be retried if it hasn't completed 1 minute after starting. And that's it. So let's give this a try. So we are now going to send our first HTTP request here, and we're going to be hitting, this endpoint. So we're going to be creating a new order. Okay, we've sent that out, and we've got 200 here. Let's take a look at our UI. Let's refresh this, and we can see that that workflow now exists. It has a start time, and the end time is blank or null. And we can see here the input data that that workflow received. We can also see the workflow ID, which in our case corresponds to the order ID. And we can see the class for that workflow as well as the function of the workflow, right? So that's that submit order function. So let's click into this, and now we can see the various, events that comprised that workflow. Um, so first we called this submit order function, and that was started. It has not completed yet. It doesn't have any end timestamp here. Following that, we reserve the inventory. That activity both started and completed, so we have its input and its output. Then we process the payment. Again, that both started and completed. We have input and output. Then we sent an order confirmed email. This also started and completed, but had no input, and this was its output. And then we had this await that we called. So if you remember, here we are waiting on this condition. So for the tracking number to no longer be null, and we're going to be waiting on that, or rather, it's going to be null until we actually signal the workflow. So we need to call this signal workflow method and pass in um, that tracking number, right, for that particular uh, order. So let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, so we got a 200 there as well. And then, if we take a look at that order workflow and pull again, now tracking number should be not null. And we should execute these two activities in parallel. So let's take a look. Let's refresh. And we can see here that indeed we now, completed this await successfully. Um, the signal was received, right? So we confirmed that it was shipped. We have that tracking number here. Signals, they only have start timestamps. They don't have end timestamps. Since they're not activities with a start and an end. They just have a certain time of occurrence. And then after that, we, had those two activities that executed in parallel. We can see here that we sent the order shipped email, and we also decreased the inventory. We then slept here for 10 seconds, and then we finally um, had the final activity where we sent a special offer push notification. And we can also see, if we go back to, the home page here, that this workflow now has an output as well, and it also has this end timestamp. And that's it. This is a super simple alternative to temporal, a super simple workflow engine And yeah, I hope you guys like it.